I funded a luxurious European getaway for my parents, but they opted to bring my sister along instead. After their departure, I revoked all the bookings. I had arranged a lavish 1 week European vacation for my parents and myself. When I arrived to transport them to the airport, they disclosed that they had chosen to travel with my unemployed sister in my place. My mother beamed. Your sister required a respite, so we decided she should accompany us. I remained silent. Upon their arrival in Europe, they encountered an unpleasant awakening. You're tardy, my mother declared, exiting onto the porch, her luggage in tow. I checked the time on my car's dashboard. 6:02 a.m. 2 minutes behind schedule. Mom, I responded, attempting a smile. I exited the vehicle to assist with their suitcases, but then I observed my sister, Lauren, emerging from the house, carrying her own luggage. My smile vanished. What's happening? I asked, striving to maintain a composed tone. My mother turned towards me, her expression excessively cheerful for the situation. Oh, Violet, we've determined that Lauren should go in your stead. She's been experiencing considerable stress recently, and this trip is essential for her. My chest constricted. In my place, Mom? I've dedicated years to planning this. I've covered all the expenses. She waved her hand dismissively, as though I'd merely mentioned a trivial matter. And we appreciate it, darling, but you're perpetually occupied with work. You can embark on another trip subsequently. Lauren requires this presently. Lauren didn't even feign remorse. She simply smirked and shifted her weight onto one hip. Thanks for your comprehension, sis, she mumbled, her voice saturated with insincerity. I gazed at the two of them, my heart pounding within my chest. My father emerged a short while later, averting his gaze and handing me his suitcase. This is preposterous, I exclaimed, my voice trembling. This was intended to be our trip, something for me to share with you. Well, it still is, my mother interjected with a smile, just with Lauren instead. Don't overreact, Violet. Your sister genuinely needs a vacation. My name is V, and I've labored extra hours for the past 2 years to provide my parents with an unparalleled vacation. Flights, opulent hotels, guided excursions. I meticulously orchestrated every element, down to the final dinner reservation. But as I stood in my parents' driveway, observing my sister settle into the rear seat of my car, I grasped a realization I had been disregarding for years. Regardless of my efforts, Lauren invariably held the top priority in their eyes. I clenched my jaw, suppressing the furious retort that hovered on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I forced a rigid smile before opening the trunk. Let's get underway then, I murmured, my voice devoid of emotion. If they preferred to prioritize her over me, that was acceptable. Do you think we'll have sufficient time for that, or will the tours consume the entire day? My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I stared fixedly ahead, compelling myself to remain silent. My mother chuckled softly. Of course, we'll have ample time. We'll determine the logistics upon arrival. I bit the inside of my cheek. Upon arrival, they seemingly failed to acknowledge that I was no longer part of that we. At one point, my father cleared his throat. Thank you for transporting us, Violet. I realize this likely feels unusual. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Unusual? That's an intriguing characterization, Dad. He remained silent, merely shifting uneasily in his seat, perhaps regretting his utterance. Lauren leaned forward from the back seat, her words cutting. You're not angry, are you? I mean, this is remarkably generous of you allowing me to go. I could never have afforded this independently. I compressed my lips and forced a strained smile. Naturally, Lauren. Enjoy the trip. By the time we reached the airport drop-off zone, my patience had evaporated. My mother embraced me as I assisted them with their luggage. Thank you for your understanding, dear. This means a great deal to us and to Lauren, my mother explained. I nodded stiffly. Certainly, Mom. Lauren smiled as she maneuvered her suitcase towards the entrance. Thanks, Violet. You're the best. I stood there, observing them vanish into the terminal, My chest constricted with fury and anguish. The return journey home was indistinct, and I replayed the conversation in my mind repeatedly, each word inflicting a deeper wound than the last. This means a lot to Lauren. You're not mad, right? You're always working so hard. I parked in my driveway and remained in the car for several minutes, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched. Then, without hesitation, I strode into the house, retrieved my laptop, and logged into every travel account I had utilized to arrange the trip. Hotel bookings were canceled, tours were refunded, and airline upgrades were rescinded. As I closed my laptop, a sense of gratification washed over me. They could explain themselves to the front desk personnel in Paris, and I was finished being their pushover. The tightness in my chest began to dissipate as I stared at the confirmation emails accumulating in my inbox. If they preferred to bring Lauren in my place, that was their prerogative, but they would not be luxuriating in 5-star accommodations or embarking on private excursions on my dime. The calls commenced as soon as their flight touched down, and as I unpacked my suitcase, the one I'd so carefully packed for a trip that was no longer mine, the irony was not lost on me. I hung up my clothes, neatly arranging my shoes back on the rack. I groaned picking up the phone and glanced at the caller ID. My mother's name was prominently displayed, accompanied by numerous missed calls and text messages. I unlocked the phone and perused the messages. Violet, what is transpiring? The hotel refuses to honor our check-in. The reservation is non-existent. Contact me immediately. Violet, this is not a laughing matter. Rectify this at once. I couldn't help but chuckle. Did they genuinely anticipate that I would swoop in and salvage the situation after their actions? The phone rang again, this time displaying Lauren's number, and I allowed it to ring until she left a voicemail. Violet, this is incredibly trivial, she stated, her voice laced with entitlement. We are stranded here due to your actions. You must contact the hotel promptly and resolve this matter. I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the remainder. I had been their problem solver for years, mitigating every blunder and compensating for their shortcomings, but no longer. I eventually decided to respond, if only to quell the deluge of calls. My mother's voice assailed me like a wave of fury the instant I answered. Violet, what have you done? The hotel assert the reservation was rescinded and none of the excursions are scheduled any longer. I permitted her to rant for a while before calmly responding, I canceled them. After a prolonged, stunned silence, she shrieked, Why would you perpetrate such an act? Oh, I'm not sure, I responded, my tone laced with sarcasm. Perhaps because you opted to take Lauren on my trip. You're fortunate I even transported you to the airport. We assumed you would comprehend, she retorted. Comprehend what? I inquired, my voice escalating. That years of economizing and planning were inconsequential because Lauren required a vacation? Did you believe my endeavors were futile? Guess what, Mom? I don't comprehend, and I don't wish to. I terminated the call before she could react and powered off my phone, tossing it onto the sofa. The ensuing tranquility was exquisite, and I felt as though I could finally inhale deeply. If they desired to prioritize Lauren, that was acceptable, but they could navigate the remainder of the journey independently. The serenity lasted scarcely a day, and the subsequent morning, my phone was vibrating incessantly with calls and messages, which I initially disregarded. I spent the day tidying the house and attending to work, but curiosity eventually prevailed, and by evening, I had powered on my phone and steeled myself for the onslaught of text messages from my mother. Violet, you've exceeded all bounds. Your sister is distraught, your father is perturbed, and we cannot gain access to any of the hotels you reserved. Lauren, you are behaving immaturely, and I fail to understand why you are escalating this into such a significant issue. Simply rectify it already. Finally, a message from my father. We must discuss this. This is unacceptable. I placed the phone down, shaking my head. For years, I had been the one to remedy situations, to ensure everyone's comfort and happiness, and now that I had withdrawn, they were at a loss. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, allowing my anger to simmer. How dare they expect me to rectify their blunder? How dare they behave as though I were the transgressor? The next call arrived minutes later, and this time I answered. "Violet," my mother began before I could interject, "this is no longer amusing. We are marooned. Do you comprehend how mortifying this is?" I took a deliberate sip of tea. Mortifying? You find this mortifying? Try dedicating years to saving, meticulously organizing every detail, and then being informed you are not even participating in the trip you financed. Cease being melodramatic, she stated. Lauren required this more than you. And now she can resolve it, I declared firmly. You have rendered your decision, Mom. You desired to bring Lauren instead of me. That's perfectly acceptable, but do not anticipate that I will finance her vacation. We are family, she asserted. We do not treat each other in this manner. I emitted a bitter laugh. Ironically, I was contemplating the very same sentiment. Lauren's voice resonated in the background, crying, "Mom, simply terminate the call. She's being obstinate." That was the final provocation. "Enjoy your trip," I stated, my tone frigid. "Oh, you can't, because it isn't your trip. That was mine, and now it belongs to no one. Farewell." I hung up before she could respond and deactivated my phone for the remainder of the evening. I experienced a peculiar blend of ire and relief. Anger that they had placed me in this predicament, but relief that I had finally asserted myself. They could label me dramatic all they wished, but for the first time in my life, I refused to allow them to exploit me. The subsequent few days were blissfully tranquil. With my phone deactivated, I finally had the opportunity to think lucidly, liberated from the barrage of guilt trips and recriminations. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on my back porch, savoring the serenity I had craved for so long. My afternoons were occupied with work and attending to minor projects I had been postponing, undertakings that reminded me of my capabilities when not burdened by their incessant demands. But on the third day, curiosity overcame me, and I activated my phone, discovering over a dozen voicemails awaiting my attention. The initial few were from my mother, who became progressively more agitated with each message. "Violet, you must return my call immediately. This has escalated beyond all reason. I cannot fathom that you are perpetrating this. You have humiliated us. We are your parents. How could you treat us with such disdain?" Then followed Lauren's messages, replete with the same entitled tone she had always employed. "This is so beneath you, even for you. You are ruining everything. Just fix it, Violet." Finally, my father's voice, lower but no less incisive. "Violet, I fail to comprehend what has become of you. Return our call so we can resolve this matter." I paused before listening to my mother's final voicemail, which was extensive and filled with exasperation and fatigue. "Violet," she said, "we are back at the airport now. The trip is ruined, and I hope you are content with yourself. Your sister is distraught, and your father and I are profoundly disappointed. Contact us when you are prepared to converse." I erased the voicemails without replying, as I was not yet ready for a conversation, and I honestly doubted if I ever would be. This was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of them prioritizing Lauren and anticipating that I would acquiesce with a smile. As the hours elapsed, I contemplated all the instances where I had been disregarded or dismissed. Every holiday where Lauren's preferences dictated the arrangements. Every family gathering where my achievements were treated as secondary considerations. This trip had been the precipitating factor, but the fissures had been developing for years. Grace arrived unexpectedly that evening, bearing 2 cups of coffee and an evident air of inquisitiveness. "I learned about the situation," she continued, placing the coffee on the table. "Your mother contacted me yesterday." "Of course she did," I responded, taking a sip. My mother was always adept at enlisting allies to coerce me into compliance. Grace shrugged, a sly smile emerging on her face. "I informed her that you were likely occupied and would respond when you were able." I laughed and shook my head. You're the best. No, you are the best, she continued, her tone becoming more earnest. Because you finally asserted yourself. I comprehend how challenging that is, Violet. Do not permit them to drag you back down. Her words resonated with me long after her departure. Grace was correct. I had spent far too long accommodating individuals who seemed indifferent to my exertions. It was time to terminate that cycle definitively. By the weekend, I experienced a peculiar sense of clarity. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from their perpetual expectations. Freedom from being the family's designated problem solver. Freedom to finally live according to my own principles. But, as anticipated, the silence did not persist. It was Sunday afternoon when I received a phone call from my father, which I elected to answer. "Violet," he said, his voice laden with fatigue, "your mother requested that I call. She believes you will listen to me." "Proceed," I murmured, reclining in my chair. He sighed. "Look, matters have spiraled out of control. Your mother is incensed, Lauren is furious, and everything is simply chaotic. But you are superior to this." I stiffened, his words eliciting a fresh surge of indignation. "Superior to what, Dad?" Asserting myself. "I refuse to permit you to walk all over me any longer." "That's not my intention," he responded hastily. "It's simply that you've always been the pragmatic one, the one who maintains order. This is uncharacteristic of you." I emitted a short, bitter laugh. "You're correct. I'm not bending over backward to rectify your blunder, which is unusual for me." He hesitated, and I momentarily believed he might finally comprehend my perspective. But then he replied, "You're punishing the entire family for a single decision. Is that truly equitable?" "Equitable?" I repeated, my voice escalating. "You wish to discuss equity? Was it equitable that you and Mom deemed me insignificant enough to be excluded from the trip I had meticulously planned? Was it justifiable that you substituted me with Lauren if I didn't matter?" "That's not our intention," he interjected defensively. "We merely believed Lauren required it more." "Naturally you did," I retorted. "You always believe she requires more attention, more support, more of everything. And I am perpetually expected to make concessions for her. Not anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and he eventually muttered, "I'm uncertain what you expect me to say." "I don't require you to say anything," I stated, my voice resolute. "I merely require you to comprehend that I am weary of being an afterthought. Henceforth, I will prioritize myself. Goodbye, Dad." I terminated the call and placed the phone down, my hands trembling. For the remainder of the day, I allowed myself to experience the full spectrum of emotions: anger, sorrow, relief. It was not effortless, but it felt like the inception of something novel. I was no longer the family's designated fixer, and I refused to be. They could learn to resolve their own predicaments. When my parents and Lauren returned, I was awaiting them in their driveway, sipping coffee and feeling remarkably composed as I observed their taxi arrive. Lauren was the first to speak as they emerged, dragging their luggage behind them, their expressions reflecting exhaustion and discontent. "Well, I trust you're pleased with yourself, Violet." I arched an eyebrow and remained seated on the porch swing. "Pleased about what?" "Our trip was a catastrophe," my mother exclaimed, waving her hand dismissively. "We spent the entire week residing in squalid hotels and consuming subpar cuisine, as we could not afford anything superior." "And don't even mention the tours," Lauren interjected, crossing her arms. "Oh, there weren't any. Do you comprehend how humiliating it was to arrive and be informed there was no reservation?" I took another sip of coffee, allowing their grievances to wash over me. "Sounds arduous," I finally responded calmly. "But you desired to bring Lauren, remember?" "I'm certain you had a splendid bonding experience." "That's beside the point," my mother retorted, her voice escalating. "You knew we couldn't afford everything you had planned. You deliberately set us up for failure. I stood up and placed my mug on the small table beside me. No, Mom, I didn't set you up for anything. I planned a trip for the three of us, something extraordinary that I had been saving for years. You are the ones who elected to exclude me at the 11th hour. My father eventually spoke, his tone more subdued but no less accusatory. You didn't have to cancel everything, Violet. That was excessive, wasn't it? I inquired, crossing my arms. Why should I have financed a trip to which I wasn't even invited? If Lauren required it so urgently, you should have organized it yourselves. You're fortunate I refrained from canceling your return flight. Lauren rolled her eyes. You're being overly dramatic. It's merely money, Violet. And you're exceedingly entitled, I retorted, my patience now wearing thin. Do you comprehend the extent of effort and sacrifice that went into planning that trip? Or do you simply assume that things will materialize for you because someone else assumes responsibility? They remained there, stunned and silent for a moment. I've dedicated years to being the responsible one, I stated, my voice unwavering but firm, the one who rectifies situations, makes preparations, and ensures everything operates seamlessly. And you've spent just as long accustomed to taking everything for granted. That's not equitable, my mother began, but I interjected, raising a hand. No, Mom. What's inequitable is the manner in which you treated me. You prioritized Lauren over me, as you habitually do. Consequently, I resolved to cease being your subservient figure. You did not desire my presence on the trip? Acceptable. But you do not get to enjoy the fruits of my labor without my participation. I retrieved my bag from the porch swing and turned to depart. I'm relieved you're unharmed, but do not anticipate that circumstances will revert to normalcy. I am finished. As I walked towards my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices a blend of indignation and remorse. But I did not look back. The drive home from my parents' residence felt strangely serene. For years, every visit had left me emotionally depleted, but this time I felt unburdened. I had finally articulated everything I had been suppressing, and for once, I was unconcerned about their reaction. Upon arriving home, I prepared a cup of tea and settled onto the sofa, replaying the confrontation in my mind. They had been so utterly confident that I would capitulate, that I would yield as I always had, but witnessing their astonished expressions as I departed was a reminder of how profoundly I had transformed. It was inconsequential whether they were angered, aggrieved, or mortified. I was finished living my life to fulfill their expectations. The following day, Grace contacted me. How did it transpire? She inquired, dispensing with pleasantries. I laughed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. Precisely as you would anticipate. They're infuriated, Lauren is sulking, and Mom is likely endeavoring to manipulate me back into conformity. Grace snorted. Let her attempt. You possess a backbone now, and I am here to ensure it remains intact. I smiled, grateful for her unwavering support. Thank you, Grace. I genuinely mean it. You've been my steadfast support throughout this. Any time, she responded, her voice softening. So what lies ahead for you now that you're no longer the family's designated problem solver? That question had been swirling in my mind since the confrontation. What was next? For years, so much of my energy had been expended attempting to appease my family and earn their approbation. But now that I had relinquished that burden, the possibilities felt limitless and somewhat daunting. I'm uncertain yet, I admitted, but I feel as though I have the autonomy to make that determination. Not them, nor anyone else. Solely myself. Sounds like the commencement of something extraordinary, Grace commented, her voice infused with optimism. Over the subsequent few weeks, I initiated subtle alterations that felt substantial in their own right. I redecorated my living room, exchanging my parents' hand-me-down furnishings for pieces that reflected my individual style. I spent weekends exploring local cafes and parks, activities I had always desired to pursue but never allocated time for, and I commenced journaling, documenting my thoughts and aspirations without filtering them through the lens of others' potential perceptions. Each minuscule step felt like shedding a layer of expectation. I hadn't comprehended the extent to which I had forfeited my identity until I sat down one evening and opened the spreadsheet I had utilized to plan the trip. The canceled reservation stared back at me, and I experienced not a twinge of regret, but rather a surge of resolve. That money had been earmarked for a unique, once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I refused to allow it to be squandered. I closed the spreadsheet, opened a new browser tab, and typed solo travel ideas. A few weeks following my parents' return, I booked a solo trip to Italy. It was not the identical itinerary I had devised for them, and it was no longer about proving a point. This was for me, an opportunity to celebrate my autonomy and, finally, prioritize myself. I had never embarked on a solitary journey before, but the instant I exited the airport and entered the vibrant city, I knew I had made the correct decision. I spent my days meandering through cobblestone streets, marveling at ancient ruins, and indulging in delectable meals at charming, intimate cafes. There was no itinerary, no one else to accommodate, just myself and the liberty to pursue whatever I desired. One afternoon, while seated on the Spanish steps with a gelato in hand, I retrieved the journal I had brought with me. For years, I had written about my aspirations, but those aspirations were invariably intertwined with making someone else content. Now, as I wrote, the focus shifted. Learn a new language. Initiate a small business. Travel to at least 5 additional countries. The list expanded, each objective a reflection of the life I desired to construct, not the one I had been expected to inhabit. On my final evening in Florence, I dined at a small family-operated restaurant overlooking the Arno River, and as I observed the sunset casting hues of orange and pink across the sky, I experienced a profound sense of tranquility. This trip had been more than a mere vacation. It was a pivotal moment. I had expended so much of my life endeavoring to earn my family's approval, but here, thousands of miles away, I realized something crucial. I did not require it. I was sufficient, precisely as I was. When I returned home, my parents attempted to reestablish contact, this time employing more subdued tones and meticulously crafted messages. Hope you had a pleasant trip. One text message from my mother read, "Perhaps we can all converse soon." I stared at the message momentarily before placing my phone down. I was not yet prepared to reply, which was acceptable. This time, it would be on my terms. And I felt a surge of pride as I unpacked my suitcase and arranged souvenirs on my shelves. A week after my return from the trip, my mother called, and this time I answered. "Hi, Violet," she said, her tone uncharacteristically gentle. "How was your trip?" "It was incredible," I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. "That's delightful to hear," she responded, pausing as if searching for the appropriate words. "We've been reflecting extensively on what transpired. Perhaps we mishandled things egregiously." The admission surprised me, but I was not about to let her off the hook so readily. "Poorly? You unexpectedly substituted me on a trip that I had meticulously planned and financed." "Poorly" is a gross understatement. "I am aware," she said. "Your father and we failed to appreciate the extent to which it would wound you." "And Lauren?" I inquired. "Does she also feel remorse? Or is she still attributing the ruination of her vacation to me?" "She's distressed," my mother said, "but I believe she comprehends that she could have conducted herself more appropriately." I sighed, leaning against the counter. "Mom, this extended beyond the trip. It has been years of prioritizing her and anticipating that I would compensate for the disparity. I am no longer doing so." "I comprehend," she responded after a pause. "We shall endeavor to improve. We do not wish to lose you." Her remarks resonated deeply within me, but I had learned not to allow guilt to dictate my decisions. "I am pleased to hear that," I replied, "but it will necessitate more than mere words to rectify this. I desire to observe tangible effort, not merely apologies." "You shall," she assured me. "We will grant you the space you require, but I trust you will permit us to re-enter your life eventually." Following the call, I experienced a confluence of emotions: relief that they were finally acknowledging their behavior, and skepticism regarding whether they would genuinely transform. But when I sat down with my journal that evening, I comprehended something crucial. Whether or not they altered their behavior was not my responsibility. Over the ensuing months, I maintained my stringent boundaries, responding to their calls and text messages when I felt inclined, but refraining from going out of my way to resolve matters or alleviate tensions. Instead, I concentrated on constructing the life I desired. I enrolled in a photography course, something I had always yearned to do but never possessed the time or energy for, joined a local hiking group, and even commenced planning my subsequent solo excursion. Each step felt like reclaiming another facet of my identity. One day, as I stood on my balcony observing the sunset, I realized the extent of my progress. I was no longer the individual who exerted extraordinary efforts for individuals who did not reciprocate respect. Instead, I was someone who valued herself, established boundaries, and was unafraid to assert her deserved entitlements. I felt utterly liberated. Thank you for watching. If you have not yet subscribed, please do so and activate the notification bell to remain informed about more astonishing real-life narratives unfolding around you.